All right, so over the weekend, there was an extremely telling exchange, or actually series of exchanges, where J.D. Vance, who I think is increasingly finding his confidence and his ability to articulate his views in a very effective way, went onto the ABC News show on Sunday morning that is hosted by the longtime ABC News correspondent and host Martha Raddatz. And the two of them had a couple of quite contentious exchanges that I think really illustrate not just the huge gap in the worldview between the type of populist right-wing factions that J.D. Vance represents and the corporate media outlets who overtly despise them, but also between corporate media employees who are generally very wealthy, who live in very protected and isolated neighborhoods, who don't experience any of the harms that ordinary people are saying that they fear, and therefore scorn those harms and insist that they're illusory, because in their lives, these problems are illusory because they live behind guarded walls and in gigantic mansions and are taken everywhere by driven limousines. And so their lives are completely detached from the lives of ordinary American citizens, and therefore they end up genuinely confused and maddened and confounded why it is that so many Americans believe things and want things and vote certain ways that they find so incomprehensible. And this widening breach between, just in the United States, but also throughout the Western democracy, between our media corporations and the elites who work in them, and the views and ideas and desires of ordinary people, is growing constantly. It's already incredibly vast. And that actually is quite dangerous when you have elites who govern the country and who shape public opinion, increasingly living lives completely isolated from and detached from the vast majority of ordinary citizens whom they claim they can speak for and understand, and in whose interests they can make decisions. So let's watch this very telling exchange between J.D. Vance, the Republican presidential nominee and senator from Ohio on the one hand, and Martha Raddatz, the ABC News anchor, on the other, regarding concerns about illegal immigrants turning violent and even becoming active violent gangs here in the United States.
The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting, because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said, rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again. And unfortunately, when you let people in by the millions, most of whom are unvetted, most of whom you don't know who they really are, you're going to have problems like this. Kamala Harris, 94 executive orders that undid Donald Trump's successful border policies. We knew this stuff would happen. They bragged about opening the border, and now we have the consequences, and we're living with it. We can do so much better, but frankly, we're not going to do better, Martha, unless Donald Trump calls this stuff out. I'm glad that he did.
So it is actually quite extraordinary that a person could be sitting in this anchor seat and essentially accuse Donald Trump and J.D. Vance of lying, which is, as you're going to see, what they do essentially every day. That's what these networks and these outlets are for, to prove that they are dogged reporters who correct lies, only lies, though, that come from Trump and his movement. Almost never lies that come from Kamala Harris, as we saw in both debates, when the fact checkers, quote unquote, directed their fact checks only to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, and never once to Tim Walz or Kamala Harris, despite how many times they also lied. It's embedded now in media culture that this is what they're there to do. And so to try and debunk the concerns that they raised when they went to Aurora, Colorado, and that they've been raising in other speeches, as a result of videos being circulated and stories being told in Aurora about armed Venezuelan gangs who have come into the country illegally, taking over apartment buildings. through force, through waving very potent weaponry and forcing residents to leave or taking over their apartments. Her response was, what are you talking about? It's only happening in a handful of apartment complexes in Aurora. It's not like it's every apartment complex, so it's really no big deal. And that's why J.D. Vance said, do you hear yourself? You are so dismissive of what is happening in these communities because in your community, none of that is happening. And that really is at the heart of everything. The vast majority of people in the United States who tell everybody that it's racist or it's evil, to be concerned with the impacts of illegal immigration and the massive flow across the border that's uncontrolled and unvetted, the vast majority of them who hector everybody else and denounce it as malintentioned or racist, even though a huge number of non-white Americans, including increasingly the Black and Latino working class, are raising this issue as well. But the vast majority of people who insist on this are people who live in neighborhoods where none of that's happening. It's just like if you live in a neighborhood that is extremely wealthy and it's guarded by private security, then it's very easy for you to dismiss concerns over crime because you're not ever experiencing crime. You have private security guards on your street. You're living behind fences. And the same is true of immigration. Whether you're for or against immigration, whether you think it's good or bad, whether you are kind of in the middle, I think, as most people are, which is the idea that immigration adds to the country, which it always has. We're a country of immigrants, but you can't have an unvetted flow over the border. Whichever your view is, there's no question that assimilating people who are newly arrived in the United States, who come from a different culture with different customs, with different religions, it takes effort to assimilate. And the more people who arrive there, the more difficult that assimilation is. Even if you end up concluding that on balance it's wonderful, it still is a effort. It's still an impact on the community that drains resources, that creates all kinds of tension and conflict, and it always has. So there's no point in denying it. But if you are not subject to that, if you never see it, then it's very easy to just treat it as an abstraction. Just like all the concerns of ordinary people, you can just treat as abstractions because your life has become protected and insulated from all of those concerns of ordinary people. And that's exactly what has happened in the media. Now, just to illustrate the point, to give you a sense for why Martha Raddatz doesn't care about immigration, even though polls show that most of the country does, here is an article from Realtor.com in May of 2017. So this is 7 years ago. And Realtor.com is devoted to very high-end, high-profile real estate purchases when people who are well-known buy multi-million-dollar homes. And there was Martha Raddatz in it, and the title was, "There's no debate. ABC anchor Martha Raddatz buys a stunning Arlington home." Quote, Martha Raddatz, ABC's globe-trotting correspondent, and her husband, NPR newsman Tom Shelton, of course she's married to someone who works at NPR, and Tom Shelton in particular, who I'm not going to delve into, but I've written about. He's one of the worst NPR people. I just think how aberrational their lives are. Anyway, they paid, again, this was 7 years ago, $2.125 million for a vintage home on a coveted block in Arlington, Virginia. The 4-bedroom, 4-bath home sits on a beautiful half-acre lot that is about 15 minutes, minus rush hour traffic, from downtown Washington, D.C. The house was built in 1900 when wealthy Washingtonians kept weekend getaways in Arlington. The previous owners, who bought the house in 2006 for $1.16 million, renovated the home and nearly doubled its size to 5,400 square feet, says listing agent Ann DiBenedetto of Washington Fine Properties. Now, if that description isn't enough for you to invoke the imagery about what Martha Raddatz's life is like, you are in luck, because here from The Observer in May of 2017 is a picture of her home. And there you can see it's really quite beautiful. It's a very manicured lawn. It has some lovely marble steps and a pathway leading up to this house. Look at the landscaping. It is quite beautiful. It's in a very coveted part of Arlington, Virginia, because of how much security there is, how low crime they have. And so if you live in this house and on this street and in this neighborhood, of course you don't care about immigration because illegal immigrants don't come into your town. There's no impact on where you live. Nobody's competing with the resources that are yours. Nobody's taking your job. They're not replacing NPR reporters or Martha Raddatz with people who can work for much lower wages because they're in the country illegally. So all of this conversation, just imagine from her perspective what a complete just abstraction it is, what an opportunity is to posture as a good, caring person because she's not the one who has to deal with the effects in her community. And this is true generally. It really used to be the case that, and I don't want to glorify the past of American journalism, but one of the big changes, there are two big changes in American journalism. One is that there used to be a very healthy, vibrant local media. And generally, local media was composed of people who were considering themselves working class. These journalists were working class. They worked on a working class wage. They came from the communities on which they're reporting. They lived in the communities on which they were reporting. You can just go back and look at any of the iconic local journalists. We've talked about some of them before. We've shown some of them before. They look exactly like the people and live exactly like the people on whom they're reporting, on whose neighborhoods they're reporting. Because that was the local media. The local media has pretty much disappeared for a whole variety of reasons. And increasingly things are consolidated in the national media. And then at the same time, the national media has become almost entirely corporatized. Almost none of this is in the hands anymore of a small family that has passed down the newspapers for generations. And even those families who do still exist, like the Sulzbergers and the New York Times, have gotten extremely rich. They get venture capital and hedge fund investments. So it's a gigantic corporation, even if it's owned by a quote unquote family. But most of them are just part of massive media conglomerates. And so the people who are the talent, who work very high up in these media outlets, the people you see on TV, they all make many millions of dollars. And they all live like Martha Raddatz or better. And this has really created a massive breach between these people who are based almost entirely in two big cities on the East Coast, which is New York and Washington, who all went to Ivy League schools, who all make a very high income, in the top 1% at least, and who live in houses like the ones we just showed you. For Martha Raddatz, it's precisely why they have no ability to understand the life of ordinary citizens or the views of ordinary citizens or what their angers are and what their grievances are. They can look down upon them, they can scorn them, they can scoff at them. Here is where the vice president lives, Kamala Harris. It's her rarely seen residence on one observatory circle. You can see inside and learn the history behind one of America's most elusive properties, the vice president's residence, soon to be home to Vice President Kamala Harris. This was in People magazine in January of 2021. They got an exclusive look where Kamala Harris lives. There you see it. That's the official residency of the vice presidency. It has some very walled off security and isolation. Here's a little bit of the inside with the very Victorian decor that also populates the White House. And this is how J.D. Vance lives too. J.D. Vance became very wealthy despite the fact that he grew up working class as a result of the book he wrote that was a huge bestseller. And the fact that he made a lot of money in Silicon Valley. We showed you his homes before, that time when there was a claim that the dossier that was published about him somehow doxed him, when his houses are very well documented and easily discoverable. But there's a big difference, which is you can live this isolated, aberrational life of wealth and security and protection that sets you apart from almost everyone else and realize that, and not assume so arrogantly and self-centeredly that you have the ability to look down on these people and judge them and condemn them for the things that they think, because you realize how wide that gap is between yourself and them. Or you can just ignore that gap, pretend it doesn't exist, and just think the reason why so many ordinary Americans think differently than you do is because they're dumb and aggrieved and misled and drowning in disinformation, and you're smart and have your eyes wide open. And that's, I think, exactly what you see in this clash, and that you're seeing all throughout the democratic world, where people are voting for parties and factions and candidates that are deeply and universally hated by the political and media elite. I mean, you see a lot of the Republican Party, the establishment wing of the Republican Party, the Cheneys and the Bushes, and a lot of others as well, being extremely hostile to Donald Trump and feeling much more comfortable in the Democratic Party. And obviously Trump has lived like this too. He's lived on the top floor of penthouses in New York, including Trump Tower. He lives in that gigantic sprawling mansion in Mar-a-Lago. But again, you can either understand that difference, be cognizant of it, try and listen to what people are saying so that you can understand their perspective, even though your life is not like theirs, or you can just assume that you're above them, and that's the reason why you think that. And in that exchange, I think that's what we're seeing. Here's one more exchange that I think illustrates this same dynamic. And as I said, this dynamic is, I think, shaping almost all of Western politics in the democratic world in a way that I think is probably the biggest factor more than any other.
I want to go back to what former President Trump said. He said they're going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas. There is no truth to that. And on staging, Pentagon officials say that active duty troops were staged and ready to go before being called upon and were instantly out the door. So President Trump, former President Trump, is saying things that aren't true about that money being withheld from Republican areas.
Well, Martha, I think you're actually confusing staging of resources from the rapid response of the U.S. military. I mean, look, in FEMA's defense, there are things after this hurricane that FEMA simply could not do. You actually need military command and control. You need military resources deployed to the area. And I think all the president has said is, frankly, what some of Kamala Harris's surrogates have said, which is that if these areas were a little bit more democratic, maybe Kamala Harris would have focused on them more. That acknowledgement is not to attack, frankly, the good folks of FEMA. It's to suggest that Americans are feeling left behind by their government, which they are, Martha.
Okay,
if you talk to folks on the ground, I've had friends that have been in Boone, North Carolina, helping with the cleanup. It is an extraordinary sense of betrayal and being left behind. People are worried that their government doesn't care about them. I'm much more worried about the incompetence of Kamala Harris's administration that led to that more than
Senator
I am
Vance,
the fact that Donald
Senator
Trump
Vance, I'm just going to say that local officials and FEMA officials say that is just flat wrong. But I want to.
They're always acting as though they're the arbiters of truth, at least when it comes to interviewing these people. But the point he was making is a point that you rarely hear, which is you can think whatever you want about Donald Trump. His flaws are very obvious, his character flaws, his flaws as a president, all of those flaws are very visible and evident and obvious. And other than his most fanatical supporters, even his more moderate supporters, more moderate in their commitment to him, recognize it and are very open-eyed about it. But the reason they nonetheless vote for him, despite those pretty serious character flaws, is because they have a seething anger toward the Martha Raddatzes of the world, toward the Kamala Harrises of the world, toward the people who rule in Washington. And Trump, whether genuinely or not, is very effective at channeling that anger, at empathizing with it, of validating it. And it should be validated because it is valid. It is true that the priority system of Washington and the people who run it in politics and media are completely detached from the ordinary people in the country. And I believe that one of the main reasons Trump won in 2016 was embodied by his convention speech when he stood up and said, I'm accepting the Republican nomination on behalf of the forgotten people, which is how most people see themselves in the United States vis-a-vis the federal government and the media outlets that they despise. They just believe that the government and the media elites do not care at all about their lives. And if you look at the priorities of the federal government, it's extremely difficult to conclude otherwise. And that was the point that J.D. Vance was trying to make to Martha Raddatz, that simply can't comprehend it. She's so interested in nitpicking what Trump said and saying this isn't true and this isn't true. But the reality is that people in South Carolina, North Carolina, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, did suffer a great deal and do suffer a great deal, just like people in Central Florida, Northern Florida, far more than they should, given that the United States is the wealthiest country on the planet, because the resources are just not directed toward them, that they are not the priority. Newsweek on October 4th tried to make the point this way, quote, how FEMA's disaster funding compares to Ukraine aid. And it was essentially saying that you can see what the priorities are of the United States and the governing class in Washington by comparing how many resources, how much energy, how much focus, how much devotion is given to Ukraine versus how much is given to the lives of ordinary people and to their communities and neighborhoods that don't live in houses like Martha Raddatz's. Quote, since the war between Russia and Ukraine began in 2022, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with almost $60 billion for weapons and security, according to the Associated Press. However, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, an independent, nonpartisan agency, claims that U.S. aid to Ukraine is even higher. Quote, Congress responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with funding of about $176 billion for U.S. agencies to provide arms to Ukraine, aid civilians, oppose sanctions, and more, the website said. President Joe Biden recently announced an additional $2.4 billion assistance package for Ukraine on September 26. In comparison, in 2022, Congress appropriated $18.8 billion in annual funding for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, which is the primary funding for domestic disaster relief programs, and has appropriated already roughly $20 billion each year thereafter. Additional appropriations measured in the billions of dollars were made in 2023 and 2024. Most recently, Congress approved a continuing resolution that provided FEMA with an additional $20 billion in disaster relief funds to be used through December 20th. So the gap between what we spent on Ukraine and Ukrainians and the lives of Ukrainians over the last 2 years and what we're willing to spend on our own citizens and their communities, and especially when they're in the greatest crises like suffering from hurricanes or tornadoes or natural disasters, is massive. And so when you see all of this money in DC and all of these politicians in DC constantly talking about sending all their money to Ukraine, or how we need billions and billions of more to finance the war in Israel, to make sure that the people of Israel, who have higher standards of living than millions and millions of people in the United States, can have what they want, courtesy of the American worker who is forced to subsidize and fund them with their taxes, which isn't spent on improving their neighborhoods or providing them with greater support, but instead is just sent to Raytheon and Boeing and every other country imaginable in order to fuel wars. And you see in that exactly what the priorities of the DC class is. And this rage that you see in every poll, people hate the DC ruling class. They hate the corporate media. They hate it. And so those politicians that can successfully channel that are the people who are going to be more popular. And it will leave those people who think the status quo is great. I mean, if you lived in Martha Raddatz's house and had her job, or you were her husband and had your job at NPR, of course you think establishment institutions are great because they're rewarding you. They're creating a society that works very well for you. So you just can't understand, why would anybody hate us? Why would anybody hate these institutions? They're so trustworthy. They've done so much good. Look at where we live. Look at the opportunities it's given us. And it's almost natural to see the world through your own interest, to see it through your own prism. And that's why, as a journalist, you should work, and especially as a politician, you should work even more to understand the difference between your life on the one hand and the vast majority of people on the other, and to understand why your interests and preferences and desires are so different. Not to give in to the instinct to dismiss them all as stupid or racist or primitive because they see the world so differently than you, but to understand that maybe the reason you see the world so differently than they is because your life is completely different. You live behind isolated walls of protection, and none of these problems ever end up getting anywhere near you. And I think those two exchanges really vividly illustrate what has become, I think, the number one political dynamic shaping politics throughout the West and the democratic world. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.